Good morning, good evening, hello, hello, hello. As you've probably already figured out with me, I love to just repeat the same word to really put emphasis on things, despite how much it gives me the ick straight away. First thing, I wonder what words we're going to stumble on today. But quick note before we dive in, I do want to apologize for my delay in getting the August episodes out. You guys are going to get an absolute influx of all of the August episodes right as September rolls in. I want to call this a mental health month that I've just had. I just got sick twice in 1 month. And truth be told, trying to juggle this and full time work, plus being a friend, plus being a partner and a dog mum is a lot sometimes. So I think we all need to remember our capacities and know when to take a break. So I took a little break, and now as I always say when I have these little breaks, I come back and I just feel so refreshed. So I feel refreshed and ready to go. Look at me. If you're watching the visuals, I'm slinging my arm out. I'm ready. So because it's been a hot minute since we've, seen each other, I think I need to remind you guys what August is all about. So August, I'm bringing, and it's going to be an influx of August because we've missed August, but for the August theme. But nevertheless, we were doing deadly beliefs, and we're still doing deadly beliefs. So those are the sort of cases that I'm going to be bringing to you over the next, I want to say week and a half. Don't put pressure on me though. So if you don't know what that means, that essentially means that we're going to be talking about cults and conspiracies and cases that revolve around belief and how strong belief can be to some people and where it can take them. So, for the very first case of this series, we're going to be talking about the Kool-Aid murders. So, if you haven't heard about Jim Jones and the infamous drinking the Kool-Aid tragedy, I'm here to bring you a little bit of a deep dive into this case. This is a story about power and manipulation and blind faith. A story about how one man convinced entire families, children, parents, the elderly to give up everything for him, and in the end, to die for him. Now, if you think you know this story, I do still want you to stick with me because today we're not just going to be talking about the infamous bodies in the jungle. We're going back to who Jim Jones was as a child, to the birth of the People's Temple, to the lives of the victims and the survivors. And we're going to do our best to unpack the brainwashing, the control, and the manipulation that these people faced within the temple. And then we're going to sit with the uncomfortable truth of what I know to have happened. So let's go back to where it all began, like we always do. So Jim Jones, who is the center of our story and the man that had the power to manipulate so many separate individuals. So Jim Jones was born on May 13th, 1931 in a small rural town in Indiana. Now, the Great Depression really shaped Jim's childhood. His father, a World War I veteran, had left weakened after being gassed in combat, and his mother worked constantly just to keep the family afloat. So from the very start, Jim's life was defined by poverty, isolation, and instability. And I want to be clear because from the very, very, very start, Jim was different. Neighbours would later describe him as odd and a very intense child. He wasn't just curious about religion, he was consumed by it. Like, this went as far as holding funerals for dead animals, which I really don't want to pinpoint this as weird because I feel like this is something I would do. And am I in the category of Jim Jones? I don't believe I am. So, but this is one thing he did. And one thing he did during these funerals was he would gather the neighborhood kids and he would preach to them. And preach with like a fire in his belly far beyond his years. His love of religion went to great depths. So he wasn't just playing church. He was rehearsing the control that a church can hold. So in school, he was an outsider, but he did have a gift, and his gift was that he could talk. He could command attention, and he loved being the center of attention. And in a place and time where churches were the center of community, Jim quickly learned how power and charisma could move people. So as Jim grew into a teenager, his obsessions grew with him. He studied preachers who could essentially captivate control over crowds. And he also read socialist texts from Karl Marx, who is quite significant in the religious community. I don't know much about him, and I didn't really deep dive too far into him. He began to form the vision of, what if you combine the two? What if socialism and religion merged into one movement? So in 1949, Jim went on to marry Marceline Baldwin, and she was a nurse. She would stand beside him for decades, even as his ambitions started to consume everything. So from the very beginning, I want to be clear. Jim was both a man who spoke of compassion, equality, and justice, and a man who desperately craved control, loyalty, and worship. Okay, so like I normally love to do throughout this, I'm going to paint a picture, because this story is based in the 1950s. So I feel like for a lot of us, it's very hard to envision this. So it's the mid 1950s in Indianapolis, Indiana. Guys, I think we found our word already. Ding dong, ding dong. So essentially, the country is in the middle of a cultural tug of war. So around this time, the Brown versus Board of Education had just been decided in 1954. And that was ruling that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional. It was a landmark decision, but within the practice, most of America was still divided by colour lines. And essentially, this is around the time that Jim Jones steps onto the scene. So in 1955, he founded what would become the People's Temple. And at first, it wasn't called that. It was a storefront church, humble, small, and the kind of place you'd walk past without even a second glance. But inside of those walls, we now know that something unusual was starting to happen. Now, Jones had insisted his church to be racially integrated. Black families and white families standed together in the pews. They ate meals side by side, they sung together, and they worshipped together. And I want to be clear because, like I said before at the start of this, where it's hard for us to put our minds in this place. But in the 1950s in Indiana, this was radical. This was unheard of. So people really did notice. So this made the People's Temple a place that became refuge for people who felt, I guess, casted aside. They offered food programs, childcare, and job assistance. They ran soup kitchens, handed out clothing, and even set up medical care for people who couldn't afford a doctor. So this was addicts, single mothers, the unhoused, people who weren't really welcomed in respectable churches. They found a belonging within this church. And Jim Jones was so smart in how he presented this. He was very meticulous in how he positioned himself within this church, because he didn't just position himself as the preacher, he was the man of action. And he wanted to really paint a picture that he wasn't just talking about equality, he was doing something about it. So in a city where segregation was essentially the normal, all of Jim's outlandish things made him stand out. This made people either run away or towards. So by the late 1950s, Jones was serving on the Indianapolis Human Rights Commission. That gave him direct access to city leaders. He worked alongside Black community activists and gained recognition for his progressive stance on integration. He even took his family, including his wife Marceline and their adopted children, to eat at restaurants that were segregated, forcing staff to serve them all together. For many, Jones looked like a hero. But during the time that the People's Temple was building its public reputation, behind all of those closed doors, Jim was weaving manipulation into the foundation in which he built. So he was staging faith healings. There's, I think what they're correctly called. I could be wrong there. So, like we do, imagine this scene. A packed hall, folding chairs, and you're squeezed together. The air is absolutely hot with anticipation. And a woman walks up, hobbling on crutches. Jim lays his hands on her, prays loudly, and suddenly she drops the crutches and she walks. The crowd erupts. People sob, shout, fall to their knees, but the miracle was absolutely fake. So Jones even went as far as to use chicken livers as fake cancerous tumours he claimed to have removed from people's bodies. If you're watching the visuals, you're seeing me. You're seeing me scratch my head and just go, what the fuck? So he essentially was convincing members that he had supernatural knowledge. So during services, he would suddenly call out a person's secret, an illness, a past mistake, a private struggle. Followers believed that he was receiving revelations from God. So the truth behind how Jim was actually able to do this was that the temple staff had collected personal information and fed it to him. So imagine sitting in the pews and hearing your most private pain revealed by the man on stage. For many, it was just terrifying, but it was also really convincing. So by 1959, the People's Temple had several hundred members. The local press had begun to write about them. And here was a church that was multiracial, modern, and outspoken against segregation. So Jones courted with journalists, he posed for photographs, and he positioned himself as the preacher and as a social reformer. So at this point, politicians had even started to pay attention. Mayor Charles Boswell, I hope I pronounced that right, and I'm sorry if I absolutely slaughtered it, because it's a possibility with me and names. I'm not good with names. I'm much better with faces and touching and feels. But Charles was essentially the mayor of Indianapolis, and he praised Jones for all of his work. He became known as a man who could mobilize people, especially poor and working class families, both black or white. So he wasn't just a preacher anymore. He was a civic leader. But inside the temple, things were already getting darker. Jones had demanded absolute loyalty from all of his members. So it seems like Jim was starting to get a little bit paranoid at this point because he was beginning to warn his followers that enemies were everywhere, racist, government spies, and just jealous outsiders. He told them that the world outside was dangerous and only he could keep them safe. So this is where we really start to see the pattern forming. On the outside, Jim Jones was this progressive hero, feeding the hungry and fighting racism, shaking hands with politicians, but on the inside, he was staging miracles, demanding loyalty, and testing the obedience of his followers. So that's a contradiction, in my opinion, that defined the People's Temple from the very fucking beginning. Real compassion mixed with manipulation, equality paired with exploitation, and a church that actually looked like salvation from the outside but was already becoming a trap on the inside. So by the early 1960s, Jim Jones wasn't just known as the leader of the unusual integrated church. He was becoming a recognized civic figure in Indianapolis. So in 1961, he was appointed as the director of the Indianapolis Human Rights Commission. So think about that for a second. Like, just really think about that. So Jones now had the power to speak on a public platform and talk about race relations, poverty, housing discrimination, and Jones knew how to use all of this to his advantage. Now, before we go any further, I want to be clear because I feel like you're probably listening to this and thinking, he sounds like a really good guy. Like, obviously there's cracks, there's red flags that we've spoken about and stuff, but just buckle in, because I guess when you deep dive, it's so hard with some of these people that you deep dive into because they're so good at painting a picture. And it's like in this one, I can half understand how he manipulated people, because in a time where people were so divided, to be that different, but to find a place where you feel comfortable enough, just put yourself there. Like, I'm which I'm sure you already are. But I'm just letting you know to buckle in. If you haven't heard this one before, just buckle in. So at public hearings, he positioned himself as fearless. He pushed back on landlords, accusing them of racial discrimination. So remember that we spoke about a little bit in the beginning that Jim would go to restaurants and demand to be served as a mixed racial table. Now, him and his wife Marceline at this point had 7 adopted children. All of these children were of different races, and he would call his family his rainbow family. That was what he proudly walked around town calling them. Now, he would deliberately refuse to leave the restaurants until they were served. And if they were denied, he would make it a public issue. So all of Jim's movements made him very popular in the civil rights activist community, especially within the Black community. To many, he was literally one of the only white pastors in Indiana, generally putting himself on the line for equality. But during this process, Jim made a lot of enemies. Indianapolis was still conservative, still segregated in practice. Business owners, politicians, and church leaders begun to sort of view Jones as a troublemaker. And I want to be clear because I always like to be super clear on what the community's thinking at this point, because behind the praise, there was some suspicion from the outside public. Was he doing this for true justice, or was it for his own ego? But inside the temple, his dual life continued. Followers were told that the outside world was evil, that racists and enemies were conspiring to essentially bring them down. And Jones just sort of continued to fuel this with paranoia. So it seemed the more public resistance that Jones faced, the more he told his followers, see, the world hates us because we are the chosen ones, because we're out here doing God's work. So here's where things start to get a little bit complicated. Not everything he did was fake. He really was pushing for desegregation. He really did hand out food and medicine. And that sort of made it harder for anyone inside or outside to question him. So at the same time, Jones's group started to really tighten on his followers. Members were pressured into giving up more of their income to the church, and he kept testing their loyalty with humiliations, with all-night meetings, and with those healing theatrics that we spoke about earlier. And slowly he was teaching them to rely on him not just as a pastor, but as a sole authority within their lives. So by 1963, Jones was absolutely relentless. He was still admired by some, hated by others, and constantly under scrutiny. And here's where another layer of paranoia begins to form. Jones becomes obsessed with the idea of nuclear war. He had essentially read this magazine article predicting that a nuclear holocaust was inevitable, and he told his followers that Indianapolis, being a major city, would be one of the very first targets. So he had begun talking about moving the entire church, about creating a safe space away from America's violence, racism, and looming destruction. And at the same time, the pressure within Indianapolis was really mounting. So at this time, the media had begun circulating, and rumors about fake healings had started spreading across the town. And some officials even kind of wanted him out of the Human Rights Commission director role. So he could feel his influence spiraling away. So in 1965, Jim Jones made a decision that would essentially change everything. He packed up his family, convinced a group of his most loyal followers, and moved from West to California. Now, he told everyone this was a matter of safety. It was for survival, and it was God's plan. But in reality, this was just his next stage of power. So here's where the story really does shift. Indiana gave Jim Jones credibility. It gave him the spotlight, the experience, and the taste of power. But California, that would give him the stage big enough to build a fucking empire. So by 1965, Jim Jones had built a reputation in Indianapolis as both a social justice crusader and a controversial troublemaker. So, on the surface, he was a civil rights activist who fed the poor and fought segregation. Behind the scenes, he was manipulating his followers. So, Jones, at this time, like we said, he had become completely obsessed with the idea of nuclear war. And essentially, he thought it was inevitable and it was going to happen. But I want to be clear, at this time in history, he wasn't the only one. This was known as the Cold War era, when school children practice hiding under desks in case of atomic bombs. But of course, as we know, Jones, like he always does, takes things further. He took it a step further. He claimed that he had visions of Indianapolis being obliterated, and he had told his followers that God had revealed him a safe zone, a place in which they could maybe survive this apocalypse. So that safe zone specifically, it was in Northern California. So like we said, in the summer of 1965, Jones packed up his family and around 140 of his most loyal followers, loaded them into buses. Now they landed in Ukiah, California, a quiet town in the Mendocino County. So Ukiah was remote and rural and it was nested within the mountains. It was the exact kind of place that Jones said would survive a nuclear blast. So the People's Temple went on to set up shop there, building a new church and communal facilities. At first, it looked like a fresh start for everybody. Families moved into their communal houses, children played together, and members farmed the land and shared meals. And for those who had left everything behind in Indiana, it kind of felt euphoric to them, almost like a utopia. But even in Ukiah, Jones's control was getting more and more intense. He had begun holding these marathon meetings, sometimes going late into the night, where followers were expected to confess sins and pledge loyalty. Families were separated and children were placed in communal houses instead of sharing homes with their parents. Members would turn over their entire paychecks, their savings, and their properties all to Jones. The temple would provide everything to them, Jones said: food, housing, healthcare, and in return, the people essentially belonged to him. So by the early 1970s, the People's Temple wasn't just surviving in California, it was expanding. Jones had even begun opening branches in San Francisco and Los Angeles, two cities where his fiery preachings about justice, equality, and socialism resonated with thousands of people. So members just swelled. And by the mid-70s, the temple claimed between 3,000 and 5,000 members, maybe even more. So with those sorts of numbers came power. Jones was no longer a preacher, he was a political player. And in San Francisco, he counted with politicians, he donated money, and he mobilized hundreds of followers to campaign for candidates. He became known as the man who could deliver the votes. Need a rally field? Call Jim Jones. Need volunteers for a campaign? Call the People's Temple. So naturally, the politicians began to notice. And haven't we been here before? But now we're talking prominent California leaders like Harvey Milk, the San Francisco city supervisor and gay rights activist, praised Jones for his work. Assemblyman Willie Brown, who would later become the mayor of San Francisco, called him an important ally. And even Rosalind Carter, the First Lady of the United States, attended a temple event while campaigning for her husband, Jimmy Carter. Like, this is how deep this shit goes, guys. Like, I can't wrap my head around some of the level of brainwashing, but Jim Jones, I mean, this being so long ago, to have this power in this time and to be so strategically smart with it, it's something else. And when you deep dive into it, it makes you feel sick. So to the outside world within California now, Jones looked unstoppable. A preacher who not only was fighting racism and poverty, but he also had an ear of powerful politicians behind him. The press was describing him as the rising star of progressive politics. But again, like we know, behind closed doors, it was so much darker. So once Jim Jones had gotten into California, things were getting a lot more intense within the temple. Temple members were being beaten at this point for disobedience, and the children were taken away from their parents and raised communally. And couples began to be separated. The followers were told that their families that were outsiders from the temple were dangerous, corrupt, and trying to pull them away from salvation. And at this point, Jones himself was slipping further and further away into paranoia and control. He was using drugs such as amphetamines to stay up for all the long nights, tranquilizers to bring himself down, and he began preaching that he wasn't just God's messenger, he was actually God. Fuck, we've heard this before, haven't we? So many people think they're fucking God. God, Mary, Jesus, and Joseph. Where are all of those? Why can't one of you guys be like Joseph or something? Anyway, moving on. So his sermons weren't just about the Bible anymore. They were about socialism, revolution, and loyalty to him personally. So by the mid-70s, the People's Temple was at its peak. Thousands of members and millions of dollars in property and assets. Connections to some of the most powerful people within California. But it was at this time that the cracks really did start to show. What's known as defectors within the religious community, I guess you could call it, were beginning to speak out at this time. Families were begging for their loved ones back. And Jones's answer at this time to all of that growing pressure that he was encountering was to find somewhere even more remote and even more isolated so that he could control more. So California had given Jim everything he wanted: power, money, and influence. But it also put him under a very big spotlight. And for a man who thrived on and in control, the spotlight felt really dangerous for Jim. So he turned to a new dream, a place far away from the media, the politicians, and the defectors, a place where no one could question him. And this place would go on to be Jonestown. So what exactly was Jonestown? Because I was so fucking confused. I'm like, the People's Temple, Jonestown, Jim Jones, this, that. Like, it is just so many layers and like so many versions of Jim Jones that like led him to the final version. So by the mid-70s, under all the growing scrutiny within California, Jones picked up and moved his people to Guyana, South America. Again, another one that I possibly slaughtered. Guyana? I think that's what it is. Let's pray that I'm right. And on paper, this place essentially looked like a socialist paradise. It was 3,800 acres of leased land in dense jungle, officially called the People's Temple Agricultural Project. So for the people who moved there, it was supposed to be everything that they had been promised: equality, safety, freedom, all away from America's racism and corruption. Families sold their homes, gave up all of their savings, and boarded planes to start their new lives in this so-called utopia. I keep using that word because throughout my research in this case, it comes up a lot. Like, people were describing it as like a utopia or a euphoric experience. And that's what people thought they were stepping into. So I can only imagine the level of manipulation some of these people were at they hadn't even completely gotten there for some of them, but this guy just had such a grip. It's fucking insane. Anyway, I need to stop swearing, but I can't because there's no other way to put emphasis on this. Now, when they arrived, the reality was different from the very beginning. So the soil across the leased land was poor, the jungle was brutal, and the heat within the area was suffocating. Food was scarce, and honestly, it seemed like there was no escape. The nearest village was miles away, and it was through thick, thick jungle. And at this point, Jones had even put armed patrol guards along the fences of the property. So Jonestown had this kind of rhythm. Members would work long hours farming, building, or cooking, and they all lived within communal sort of small cabins. And essentially they were fed rice, beans, and occasionally a bit of meat. Now, over the loudspeakers within Jonestown, and I'm going to call it Jonestown Camp because it was a camp, Jones had actually set up his voice to play across the loudspeakers all day and all night. So it's all the members heard. Now, he was rambling sermons, warnings about enemies, lectures about socialism. So imagine trying to sleep at night, because I mean, this shit run 24 hours a day, 24/7, with your leader's voice just booming across the jungle. It's pretty easy to understand how quickly these people got brainwashed. Like they were trapped. And then all day, every day, they've got this booming voice in their head. Like, of course they're going to believe it. So at this point, the members just like, they could not escape him. They couldn't escape him in fucking reality. They couldn't escape them in their dreams. Like it was everywhere. I always start to get stuttery at the middle of these episodes, like an hour in, you start to get like itchy. So this is where I guess the real brainwashing really begins, because I mean, these people have been, I guess, pre-primed and ready for some easy ass brainwashing from here. He's done some lead up work to this. Jones was deliberately wearing these people down. He would call all of those late night meetings that would stretch until dawn, forcing people to sit for hours and hours as he ranted. Sleep deprivation will make you complacent. Exhaustion erodes your ability to question. And that was the point. He created an atmosphere of fear. He told his followers that assassins were coming for them, that the CIA was planning to destroy Jonestown. And all these guards with rifles would stand at the back of the meeting while Jones ranted. So even if anybody had, a grain of go in them, like, oh, hang on, I might question this. Why the fuck would you? There's a rifle behind you. Talk about planting fear in people. And at this time, Jones had started to warn parents that had children within Jonestown that if they questioned anything or raised any concerns, that their children would just be taken. So then we reach the public confession sessions. So this is where members were accused of disobedience and were dragged in front of the group. And they had to confess their sins. So sometimes these sins were actually real, but often they were imagined. They were humiliated, they were yelled at, and they were even beaten, all in front of people. It was a psychological warfare that Jones had sort of begun to break people down in front of the only community that they had left. And one survivor, Deborah Layton, later described these sessions as terrifying. In her memoir, she wrote that even her children were punished publicly, spanked or beaten in front of everybody. And this was to essentially send a message. And the result in the end was that the members policed themselves, terrified of being the next one to be dragged into the spotlight. And then Jones came up with this thing called White Nights. So Jones would call emergency meetings and announce that enemies were closing in and tell everyone that they had to be ready to die. On some nights, cups of red liquid were passed around. People were ordered to drink, and they were told that it was poison. They sat in silence and waiting for death. Then after a few long minutes, Jones would laugh and say, that was a test. So let's just wrap our fucking heads around the impact of that. You're drinking a liquid and thinking you're going to die. And then you don't. So the relief floods in because I'm sure these people didn't want to die. And I'm sure that in that relief for some people was that they really did know that their loyalty for Jones had deepened, because that was the level of brainwashing that these people were at. That's where they were at. Now, he kept doing this over and over and over until the act of drinking the poison almost became normalized within the community. And I guess until the day that it wasn't a test anymore. So before we get into the end of our case, let's not forget that these weren't faceless cult members. They were teachers, farmers, grandmothers, young couples, and they were children. So take Christine Miller. She was a member in her 60s who would later be remembered for standing up to Jones in the final moments. Even in Jonestown, she was known for questioning him, sometimes gently and sometimes boldly. During the White Night rehearsals, she would argue with him, saying that there had to be another way. She represents the handful of people within Jonestown that still held on to an independent thought. And we know that in Jonestown, that was dangerous. And then there was the Layton family, one of the most influential families inside the temple. Larry Layton was so devoted to Jonestown and Jim Jones that he later boarded a plane with Congressman Leo Ryan attempting to kill de factors in defense of Jones. His sisters Debbie and Annalisa saw the darkness earlier and tried to escape. The family was torn apart by loyalty and by betrayal, embodying just how deep Jones's control really divided loved ones. And then there were the children. Survivors recalled how children were raised communally, often separated from their parents. They were taught to see Jones as their real father and their protector. So imagine being 6, 7, 8 years old, chanting slogans about death as salvation. This wasn't just brainwashing in the abstract. It was systematic. Sleep deprivation, fear, humiliation, loyalty tests, poison drills. Jim had created a world where questioning him was not just wrong, but impossible. So by 1978, Jonestown wasn't the paradise that its members had imagined. It was an absolute prison, hell on earth, a place where people worked until they were broken, where every waking hour was filled with Jones's voice, and where the idea of mass death has been rehearsed so many times that it felt inevitable to the community. And the most chilling part is that so many of these members and followers still believed him. So when we talk about Jonestown, it's kind of easy to get lost in the big picture, the politics, the cult leader, and the infamous death toll. But let's pause here and just remember that this was a community made up of individuals, real people, real stories, and real families. So by 1978, there was more than 900 people living within the Jonestown community. Now, it's hard for me to break down every single member that was within the community and every single member that didn't make it. So we've spoken about a few, and I will cover a few more because I think it's important that we remember that these people within this cult were human beings. So Edith Roller, for example. Edith was a 63-year-old English professor who joined the temple later in life. She kept journals while she was in Jonestown. So this is some of the only surviving first-hand record that we've actually got of what it was like in Jonestown. Her entries are truly haunting. She writes about the endless meetings, the hunger, the exhaustion. She wrote about the moments of pride, planting crops, teaching children, and believing that she was a part of building something bigger than herself. And unfortunately, Edith didn't make it out alive. Now, we spoke about the Layton family. There was also the Woog family. It's French, so please forgive me, but if I say it the Australian way, it sounds like I'm saying bug. So, Hyacinth and her daughters, Patricia and Judy, moved into Jonestown believing its promise. Judy later recalled in the beginning how it really did feel like a community, where race didn't matter, where everyone worked together. But in 1978, Judy said they were complete prisoners. The food was scarce, the punishments were harsh, and nobody dared disobey Jones. So by late 1978, the cracks in Jones's empire were beginning to widen. Back in the United States, families of the temple members were beginning to beg for help. They hadn't heard from their loved ones in months. Letters were censored, visits were denied, defectors had begun to speak out, describing Jonestown as not a utopia, but as a prison. One of the loudest voices was Deborah Layton, who had escaped earlier that year. In a sworn affidavit, she described white night rehearsals, armed guards, starvation, and the possibility of mass suicide within the Jonestown community. Journalists had begun investigating and publishing exposés. And then the US government stepped in. Congressman Leo Ryan, a Democrat from California, who would later be attacked by one of Jonestown members, which we know, had made a reputation for publicly investigating complaints. If a family called Leo Ryan and said that their son was trapped in a jail, he would get on a plane and find them. So naturally, when families begun saying that their loved ones were trapped within Jonestown, Ryan agreed to go. On November 14th, 1978, Ryan and a small delegation flew to Guyana. The group included aides, journalists from the NBC and the San Francisco Examiner. And then, of course, the worried relatives of the temple members. And their mission at this point was really just to see Jonestown with their own eyes. And at first, Jones was putting on a show. When Ryan's group arrived to Jonestown on November 17th, they were greeted with smiles, music, and rehearsed speeches. The members were singing songs about freedom and equality. The members were telling the congressman how happy they were, how much they loved Jim Jones, and about how Jonestown was essentially a paradise. The cameras rolled and recorded a picture-perfect scene. But under the surface, fear was bubbling. During the visit, one temple member slipped a note into a reporter's hand. On it, he had scribbled, "Please help us get out of Jonestown." And then others soon followed, quietly approaching Ryan's team and whispering that they wanted to leave. So in the space of a few hours, the facade had completely cracked. By the next day, November 18th, around 15 people had declared that they wanted out. For Jones, this was just the ultimate betrayal. Every defecation was proof in his paranoid mind that the enemies were conspiring against him. And now, not only were people leaving, they were doing it in front of the cameras and in front of the US congressman. And that afternoon, Ryan tried to reassure the group in front of the entire community, who stood up and said, "I can tell you right now, from the few conversations I've had with the folks here, that almost everyone seems to think that this is the best thing that ever happened to them." The crowd applauded. But then suddenly a man lunged with a knife. The attacker was wrestled to the ground, and Ryan did survive. But the message was clear. Jones had lost complete control, and his paranoia was tipping over into violence. Ryan and his delegation decided to leave immediately, taking the defectors with them. They headed to Port Kamutuma. I'm pretty sure I just slaughtered that. I think we found the other word, guys. But this was essentially a small airstrip that they had within the jungle. So the group was separated into two and boarded across two planes. They loaded their luggage in and even filmed the tent's departure. And then the trucks came in. Now, these were armed templemen, members of Jones' security force. So out of these trucks appeared the armed templemen. So these were Jones's security that he had along the fences. Remember, we spoke about those before. So they all rolled out and opened fire. Congressman Leo Ryan was shot more than 20 times and killed immediately. NBC reporter Don Harris, cameraman Bob Brown, Examiner photographer Greg Robinson, and defector Patricia Parks were also killed. Several others were wounded. One cameraman managed to keep his camera rolling until the moment of his death. Footage that survives today as a chilling testament of what happened on that jungle airstrip. So back in Jonestown, word reached to Jim Jones immediately. The congressman was dead. His people had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. So Jones knew exactly what his next move was. So this was the trigger. This was the years and years that he had been rehearsing for. For years he had warned everyone and even himself that his enemies were coming. And now, with the blood of his followers' hands, he told them the time had come. The final white night had arrived. So word of the airstrip massacre reached Jonestown in the late afternoon of November 18th, 1978. Jim Jones gathered everyone in the open-air pavilion, the heart of settlement, under a large tin roof surrounded by wooden benches. So over 900 people came forward, summoned by his voice over the loudspeakers. The people didn't know this yet, but this time wasn't a rehearsal. Jones told them that the congressman was dead, that there was no turning back now. He insisted that the US government was going to come for them, that soldiers would parachute into the jungle, torture the children, and destroy everything that they had built. His words were recorded on an FBI tape that would later be labeled the death tape. On that tape, you can hear him saying, "We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide protesting the conditions of an inhumane world." So for many in that crowd, this wasn't a choice. Guards with rifles stood at the edges of the pavilion. Mothers clenched onto their children. Fathers looked helpless. People whispered, cried, and some prayed. But most knew resistance was absolutely useless. Large vats of grape-flavored aid, already mixed with cyanide, sedatives, and tranquilizers, were brought out. Members of the medical staff, loyal to Jones, began to fill the cups. Parents were told to take their children to the front first. And here is where the order began to spread. So essentially, it started with the babies. Syringes filled with poison mixtures were used to squirt directly into the infant's mouth. Survivors later said the screams of the children were almost unbearable. One survivor, Odell Rhodes, remembered parents wailing at their babies as they went limp in their arms. But all the armed guards around them urged them on. And once the children were gone, adults were instructed to drink. Some went willingly, convinced that Jones was right and that death was better than what was coming. And others were just coerced by all the guards around them, pressured by neighbours, and told that they had no choice. Some did try to run, and they were injected with syringes against their will. Now, the poison did work quickly, within minutes. People revulsed, foamed at the mouth, collapsed. The pavilion became a scene of chaos and absolute despair. Rows of bodies began forming on the ground as more and more people fell. And still, Jones kept speaking, his voice calm, commanding, and almost soothing. On the tape, you can hear him insisting that this is the only way, urging people to not be afraid. He told parents, "Don't be afraid to die. Death is just stepping over into another plane." But I want to be clear that not everybody agreed. They really, really didn't agree. But you can imagine the scene, and even if they didn't agree, what way out did they have at this point? Now, Christine Miller, who we did speak about, the woman in her 60s known for speaking out against the White Knights, argued again. She begged Jones to let them live, to try another solution. Her voice was strong and desperate. You can hear her saying in the tape, "I think we should all try to go to the Soviet Union. I don't think it's impossible." And then you can hear Jones shutting her down. He told her that she was being selfish, that her fear was betraying the group. And on tape, you can hear the crowd turning against her, shouting her down. And then her voice is gone. Sorry, forgive me. I am getting emotional listening to all of these, not listening, speaking about all of these, just all of this. So bear with me because my voice is beginning to crack a bit. This happens sometimes, guys. I'm only human. So the order did spread quickly from here because once the parents had poisoned their children, they had little left to live for. And many followed. Some collapsed together in family groups holding hands. Others laid down quietly beside friends. And some survivors, like Stanley Clayton, later said that the sound was unbearable. Crying, choking, screaming, and then silence, as one by one, people stopped moving. So by the end of the night, more than 918 people were dead. Over 300 of them were children alone. Jim Jones himself didn't drink the poison. He thought that getting a gun and giving himself a single gunshot to the head was a nicer way to go out. But of course, he wasn't going to give anybody else that benefit. No, no, no. Now, it is believed that that wound was self-inflicted. I don't think there has ever been any accurate background on whether it was or not. If you know, please let me know. The pavilion at Jonestown was filled with bodies, mothers clenching onto children, families laying in groups, rows and rows of people. But not everybody drank. Not everybody died there. And there was a handful of people that made it out through chance, through quick thinking, or simply just being away at the right moment. Odell Rhodes was one of them. As the poison spread through the crowd, Odell quietly slipped into the jungle. He didn't run, not yet. He just crept really slow and really careful through the bush, terrified that the guards would catch him, but being very careful. He later said that the screams of the children being poisoned echoed as he walked away, and he has never forgotten that sound. Stanley Clayton also escaped. He took his chance when the guards were distracted, running into the thick jungle bush and not looking back. Stanley spent the night hiding, listening to the cries that faded into silence, before finally making it back to safety. Others survived simply just because they weren't there. Tim Carter, for example, had been sent out on an errand to deliver money, and when he returned, he would find Jonestown silent and the community that he helped build gone. And there were also elderly members and sick individuals who had been housed in different areas of the camp. Some survived mostly because they weren't brought to the pavilion in time. But the majority of the people within Jonestown, they didn't have any way out. Armed guards surrounded the pavilion. Families had already lost their children and felt too broken to resist. And the conditioning, years of drills, rehearsals, fear, exhaustion, it had all done its job. So when the Guyanese authorities finally arrived days later, the scene was unlike anything that anyone had ever witnessed before. Rows of dead bodies in the blazing sun, already decomposing due to the heat. Over 900 people lined up as if they were sleeping. American troops were sent over to recover the dead. The images that they brought back shocked the world. Aerial photos of hundreds of bodies in colourful clothes laying side by side in the middle of the jungle. This would go on to become one of the most infamous photographs of the 20th century. And then there was Jim Jones, who was found slumped in his chair on the pavilion stage with his gunshot wound to his head. Unlike his followers, like I said, he had not drunk the poison. He had chosen the quicker end. So at this point, when the world saw it, it's safe to say the world was stunned. Newspapers around the globe had run headlines around mass suicide in the jungle. Television reports showed the horrifying aerial images. For many, it was the first time they'd ever even heard of Jonestown. And overnight, the term drinking the Kool-Aid became a phrase, a flippant shorthand of blind obedience. But for the survivors of Jonestown, the trauma and the effects of what happened is long-lasting. People like Stephen Jones, Jim's own son, who survived because he'd been away from the temple at a basketball game. He later went on to speak about the guilt of living when his mother and his siblings and all of his friends had died. And people like Deborah Layton, who had escaped months earlier, now forced to live with the knowledge that her warnings hadn't been enough. So to me, I want to be really clear. This was not mass suicide. It wasn't revolutionized suicide, whatever the fuck Jones wanted to call it. This was mass murder. He murdered them. He murdered them all. So back home, the question on everyone's mind was how? How the fuck could this happen? How could so many people willingly drink poison? In Washington, politicians were shaken. Congressman Leo Ryan's assassination was the first time in American history a sitting member of Congress had been murdered in the line of duty. It kind of forced the US government to ask those hard questions about cults, religious freedom, and how groups like the People's Temple operated unchecked for so long. And of course, I will always touch on very, very quickly, the conspiracies, of course, began immediately when all of this happened. Some claim that the CIA had been involved, that Jonestown was created as part of like a mind control experiment similar to the MK Ultra. Others suggested that Jones had been assassinated, that he hadn't pulled the trigger on himself. But of course, no credible evidence has ever surfaced for any of those theories. So this case is, I reckon, nearly one of the hardest cases I've ever had to cover, just because of the depth and the heartache and the stories and the fact that you actually can't cover every story because you don't have the information. And that is so sad to me. And the truth is, this didn't start with poison. It started with a promise. Jim Jones promised equality. He promised safety, justice, and belonging. He built a community that felt like family, especially for people who had been told all of their lives that they didn't belong anywhere else. And then slowly he turned that promise into a weapon. Sleep deprivation, fear, confessions, fake miracles, poison rehearsals, until one day those drills weren't drills anymore. Until one day one man's paranoia and hunger for power erased 918 lives. So Jonestown isn't just about a cult. It's about what happens when you give someone too much trust, too much power, and too much control over our lives. It's about how easy it is to slip from hope into obedience, from obedience into fear, and from fear into silence. It's about the voices that did resist, like Christine Miller, who begged not to drink, or Deborah Layton, who tried to warn the world. So when you hear the phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid, I want you to remember this. Remember the children, remember the families, and remember the people who just wanted a better life. So that is it for today's episode of Chaotic Crime. If you've got any thoughts or questions on this case, you know where to find me. Our email is in the link below, and you can always send us a direct message on TikTok or Instagram. On that, don't forget to check out our social media accounts. I've tagged them all below. If you want a further deep dive, I've also tagged that below. So until next time, stay loud, stay curious, and never stop asking questions.